Hello everyone, Stakuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. And also, on that note, welcome back to the third episode of I Watched It So That You Didn't Have To, in which we are doing the African Queen series here on Netflix, and it's the third episode of Njinga. Now, I'll be honest, I honestly didn't think that I was going to actually make this episode in the first place because I've been out of my house for the past couple days here. I'm not even in my studio right now as we're recording this. I'm in a hotel room. So you can already probably notice that this whole thing looks a little bit different. But also, on the other note, the reason why I didn't think that I was going to make this is because the previous two episodes, as I had been watching, were honestly not all that bad. Yes, there were things that were deliberately left out. Yes, there was a number of things that were put in there that were quite political in nature. And yes, there were some things that were just over-dramatized crap. But if anything, the series was significantly better than what I had seen from Queen Cleopatra, as that whole thing was an absolute dumpster fire. That is, of course, until we got to this third episode. Easily, out of all the ones that we have covered in here so far, the third episode is by far the worst episode, and I'm going to be going in through this from the very beginning. So buckle up, buttercups, because we're going to be getting into this. If you remember how things had ended in the previous episode, with Njinga going and doing that strong girl move and assassinating the 7-year-old child at her own wedding with the Imangala leader, Kasa? Yeah, that is where, well, as I said, the story kind of leaves off, and what ends up happening with the story is that the wedding immediately gets annulled because of these actions, and the alliance between them gets called off. But it is okay because Njinga finally gets her crown and it is in her hands and everyone is celebrating and happy and yay, Njinga's finally in charge. They're all celebrating. Absolutely everyone seems to be happy with this, but Netflix is leaving out a lot of information which we're going to be covering here in a little bit because no, not everyone was happy and it was not a happy-go-lucky kingdom in which she was just in charge of everything with no challengers. But no, they're going to conveniently leave all of that out. We're going to get into it. Fast forward a little bit of time into now 1625 and she is on the Kindonga Islands. But the first weird thing to happen is that at their war camp, as they're discussing all of the horrors of the Portuguese, is that it goes to the shot of these 3 children who apparently had escaped from a Portuguese raid and lost their families. And it's talking about the horror and the brutality specifically of the Portuguese in here and how Njinga, feeling bad for them, goes over to them and presents them with food, like does this charitable act to try and bind them all together and talk about how she's going to punish the evil Susa for his ways. And I say that sarcastically and dramatically because that's pretty much what is going on here. Netflix keeps on doing these things where it inserts and creates dialogue and scenarios of which there is no evidence for, and it does it specifically in ways to make Njinga a hero. She has to make the Portuguese as evil as possible, or rather Netflix has to make them as evil as possible, and create as many scenarios as they can for her to be this person that is only loving and caring and selfless for her people. But as we're going to get into this, it's going to ignore a lot of the things that she did. The whole sequence with her sisters here and talking about their revenge is just so grandiose and incredibly cringy and dramatic. Which, on that note, it then jumps to the queen that they have for this documentary, one of the experts that is providing testimony for it, to say, oh, quote, she does not believe that Portuguese slavery is okay, that her people can be taken captive. This is not true, Netflix. They're going to do this countless numbers of times because this is the episode where it starts to get really important, but they keep on ignoring the aspects that she specifically contributed to the slave trade and how she was actively selling people to the Portuguese before. But they're going to completely ignore the morality of it because no, they have to push her forward as an anti-slavery crusader when that wasn't the case. She was anti-Portuguese because she didn't want them involved in their affairs. This is outright false. But one of the bigger problems with this is that how they're framing this now with the Portuguese at their doorstep and fighting is that they are skipping a lot of context that they just do not talk about in the documentary because they want to frame her as much of a freedom fighter as possible, completely ignoring a lot of the other actions that she was taking, or what was even happening in her kingdom at the time. Like here, let me go ahead and set the stage for you for what was going on that Netflix just does not talk about at all. Like we go back to the beginning where she's being crowned and taking everything over in the kingdom and everyone is all happy and celebrating that she's in charge now. That was not the case. Her ascension to the throne faced severe opposition from any of the other male claimants from other noble families that wanted the throne for themselves. And it just does not touch upon that at all. Because if you look at the actual traditions of her people, neither her or her brother, like the guy who was the previous king, technically qualified to have been the ruler in the first place. And this was going to be something that would create a lot of contention and a lot of infighting in the kingdom for years, but they don't talk about it. they were the children of slave wives, not the first wife, not the primary wife of the ruler. In addition to that, the fact that she was a woman was going to be a huge issue because the kingdom did not actually have a tradition of female rulers, at least not in their specific area, so she was constantly being challenged by male claimants that did not believe that a woman could be in charge. Because she was a female, she was ineligible. That was the general view of a lot of the nobility within the kingdom. They weren't all just celebrating. And in addition, it's talking about continuously about how much she hates the Portuguese and how much she's fighting the Portuguese, but over the course of this entire time, she has been negotiating with the Portuguese, and that fact is ignored in here, and simultaneously it was one of the things that was turning a lot of nobles against her. But no, Netflix just completely ignores all of this, and yay, everyone is celebrating her, and she's the freedom fighter that is waging war against the Portuguese. No. Oh, also this whole thing that they put in here about her hatred towards de Sousa, yes, that would eventually become a thing, but they skip over how during the years leading up to this, because it completely bypasses it, that she and de Sousa were working together specifically in order to try and reopen the slave trade between them, because they needed the slave trade in order to fund both of their economies. She was actively working to open it back up, not fight against it. So it starts in 1625, but in 1624 and prior, they had actively been working together, and because of a fallout between them and when negotiations broke down, it was only after that, going into 1624, that the Portuguese would launch their strikes against her and her kingdom, gradually turning the different sobas, those minor nobles, against her to turn them into vassals of the Portuguese. I'm not even showing different images at this point. Like, all of this information that they're presenting that they just skipped over it's either wrong or they just literally don't say anything. And that's why I have to talk so much over so little. It's so incredibly frustrating at this time. They even went on to specifically mention how Njinga went in and shut down the slave markets. Like, she went in, closed down the roads, and cut off the areas that the Portuguese would have access to the slave markets where they primarily were purchasing their slaves from. But they had never touched upon this previously, how most of the slaves in the first place were being bought because it was the system that was already in place that she had worked together with them to reopen because she was selling them slaves. But no, Netflix can't acknowledge any of this really. It can't really talk about it because what that's going to then do is hurt the image of her being a freedom fighter. But okay, so Njinga is at this point harassing the Portuguese operations. She is doing things in order to try and disrupt them. Like, as an example, she is sending out messengers all across the kingdom and into Portuguese-controlled territory in order to incite slaves to either rebel or to flee the plantations, and in order to join her to boost her numbers and weaken the Portuguese economy. She is doing these things and they do touch upon it. And the Portuguese, very angry by all of this, do end up sending a delegation to them in order to negotiate for the return of their slaves and to complain. To which she responds in a very dramatic tone, but I promise you this is a 100% real thing, so this is not Netflix making it up. When Portugal demands the return of the slaves, she says, "I don't have any slaves. There are no slaves in my kingdom." That was a real line that she specifically did use. It's not Netflix trying to frame things politically. She did, in fact, tell the Portuguese this after negotiations broke down, but the framing of the entire conversation that it has between her and this diplomat, if you want to even call it that, is so incredibly dramatic and cringy, and it's really bad dialogue. But that line that they put in there is indeed real, even if it's ironic because historically that's not true. She did have slaves, she did sell people into slavery, and she specifically would sell slaves to the Europeans. It's just a real line that was used in order to purposefully piss someone off, which I find funny. So yes, after more cringy dialogue and threats in which she threatens the Portuguese diplomat that he potentially could become someone else's property, if he didn't watch his step going back home. And after some more very cringe dialogue, it then moves on to talk about how her show of force that she had here in the beginning, as she starts to rally some of the people to her, is that a number of those sobas who had initially sworn allegiance to the Portuguese begin to side with her. And I do like the fact that they acknowledge here that the Portuguese specifically were relying on the sobas, the minor nobles within the kingdom, in order to provide them tribute, and the key form of tribute that the Portuguese were looking for was slaves. But the issue that I draw from this is that it again does not acknowledge the fact that this is where the majority of slaves were coming from, not from raids, but rather from tribute and from the market. So it's like Netflix is speaking truths here, but it's half-truths because it never wants to tell the full story. And my wife would tell me this all the time of different things when I'd be trying to avoid trouble, but a lie by omission is a very bad lie. Isn't that right, Gabby? She just gave me a thumbs up right now. And that is the biggest problem that this Netflix documentary series now seems to have, is just massive lies by omission, because they keep on framing things in certain ways and completely forgetting any number of other details that are very important to the story, even things that would actually help their case of framing Njinga as a badass. Which I don't get why that would happen. Like, okay, let me give you a big example of this. By 14 minutes, it skips over to the year 1626, but it completely skips all of the context of the previous years that has led Njinga to this point and all of the other troubles that she is facing. Because despite the fact that Njinga was having some success against the Portuguese, the policies that she was implementing at this point specifically was hurting not only the income of the Portuguese, but of her own people that she was claiming to protect the sovereignty of in this documentary. A large number of the nobles within her kingdom specifically made big amounts of money from the slave trade. And so what she was doing in order to stop it, to cut off the Portuguese from a source of their income and trying to take control of it for just herself, that meant that the nobles that were serving under her were getting undercut and hurt. So a large number of them started to rebel against her and side with the Portuguese at this point. But it completely skips that. Like, it doesn't touch upon it, but there was a full-on civil war that was going on at this point, because in the year 1625, the Portuguese went and they sent soldiers in order to protect an individual by the name of Hari Akiluanje. And this guy was one of the Sobas, he was one of the local nobles under Njinga that broke ties with her and instead rebelled against her, because he himself was also a descendant of the royal family and really did not like the fact that there was a woman on the throne, but they're never going to really touch upon that. So upon learning of this rebellion, Njinga then goes and sends warriors to crush it, but her forces actually get defeated. She doesn't win, which in turn causes even more nobles to rebel against her. But again, they don't mention this. So Njinga then goes and petitions the Portuguese to try and get them to stop supporting the rebels inside of her country, but she was only doing this specifically to delay things as long as possible so that she could gather her forces, and the Portuguese saw this, so no, they continued to foment rebellion inside of her kingdom and work against her, just as she was working against them. But again, it does not say this. So they go and recognize Kiluanje as the actual king of Ndongo, and then declare war upon her on the 15th of March, 1626. So again, they skip years of context to move ahead as though she's somehow united the whole nation behind her, when she has not. So it then moves on, it shows the Portuguese going and moving into the attack, a battle breaks out, which honestly, I gotta say, with the twirling and the dancing and the other crap in here, it's genuinely one of the worst choreographed fights I have ever seen in my life. Like, I don't even get what's going on half the time in here. At one point, there is a line of troops that are standing up here, like 6 dudes with matchlocks firing, but there's no kind of reasonable military force whatsoever looking in this. It just looks like a couple dudes, like maybe 12, along with some girls mixed in, ended up getting into a brawl in the middle of the forest. It looks awful, but that's their war apparently. And Njinga, from all of this, is defeated and has to flee. This is then followed by Njinga being depressed about the way that things are going, even though it only showed really one battle, but it doesn't touch upon the fact that this isn't the only one. She's lost battle after battle after battle at this point, and things are really going bad for her. And so she's depressed, but then needs everyone around her to talk her up then and get her back on track mentally. You know, to be the real hero that Netflix is framing her as being. But then it talks about how after the latest battle, she has to escape in order to preserve her own life, which yes, she does, and yes, that is accurate. But Netflix completely skips over the fact that she abandoned the majority of her forces, left them behind in order to save her own skin in order to regroup and come back later. So it talks about the fact that she left her sisters behind to be safe, that she then needs to leave that night under the cover of darkness so that they can all be safe, and then orders her attendants to wake the other people so that they can leave, which maybe for the couple of attendants that she had with her, but again, it completely omits the fact that she abandoned the majority of her forces, specifically in order to be able to escape herself, to slip out unnoticed. So basically, she abandoned her forces to the Portuguese as slaves. But again, Netflix does not touch upon it. So okay, Njinga escapes, she leaves her sisters behind, and then it shows how she at this point is trying to negotiate with the Portuguese Portuguese in order to be able to secure support for her kingdom and stop the fighting, like actually negotiate. And so she sends forward a diplomat with gifts to the Portuguese in order to offer them as a kind of tribute along with a series of concessions. But the way that they frame it in here is so dumb because they start to be kind of truthful. They say that what she asks of the Portuguese is that she wants peace and also support from them in order to be recognized as Queen of Ndongo, as like the rightful ruler, which she did do. And it also does touch upon the fact that she offers to reopen the slave markets, which is true, she did do. But then it completely leaves out the fact that the tribute that they're then presenting to the Portuguese is not merely composed of like a rug and some like shell jewelry, I think I can see there. I don't even know what it is at this point, but it's like, this is the tribute that is being offered. But no, she offered the Portuguese at this point 400 or so slaves as a gift for them at the negotiation table. But Netflix cannot show that she did this because that would counteract the entire argument that they've been presenting from the very beginning that is showing her as an anti-slavery crusader. And it's so incredibly frustrating because it's leaving all of this out that is real parts of her character. She is way more complex than they are giving her credit for. And I know I'm getting frustrated. I know I'm getting angry right here because the sheer amount of things that are omitted from this episode that she did or experienced is terrible. She offered to reopen the slave markets that she herself was operating. She was offering tribute and to be a vassal to the Portuguese. They do not mention that. And they gave as a gift 400 slaves to the Portuguese, which is completely ignored, not touched upon. It skips almost every single detail of the negotiation, specifically because it cannot have her framed as anything other than this strong girl boss character that is against slavery. But okay, by this point, the Portuguese do not accept the negotiations, they move on, they attack the diplomats instead, and what then follows is that they have him executed, which is a real thing that happened, and they do touch upon that. But the other part of the negotiations that pisses me off because it omits it is that whole issue where it says the line to recognize me as the rightful queen of Ndongo is because it then does not touch upon the fact that, again, there was a civil war that was going on at the time because there was a pretender king who was on the throne, and that king was basically a Portuguese puppet at this point, which I also have to mention that it's not Kilonje or like whatever that guy's name was here before. It's a completely different person. That guy ended up dying, so another one had to be placed onto the throne, which was effectively a Portuguese puppet. But no one's going to recognize anything that I'm talking about at this point because it's not said in the documentary at all. That is why she was trying to negotiate to be recognized as the ruler. Because what happened before was that one guy, Kulanje, had ended up dying of smallpox, which then forced the Portuguese to replace him with another guy called Ngolahari. He was another nobleman, but his big problem was that he was very unpopular, which ended up creating this whole dynamic in the kingdom where you were siding either with Hari, who was unpopular and people despised him because he was a puppet to the Portuguese, or you sided with Njinga, who was a woman. And it feels really weird that that is how I'm phrasing that dichotomy, but you have to understand that that was the issue that was going on at this time, was that they viewed Njinga as not the legitimate ruler because she was a woman. So what ended up happening at this point is that a bunch of the minor nobles and sobas ended up supporting Njinga because they didn't have as much authority, so they rallied around her. Meanwhile, the much more powerful nobles were rallying around Hari because they had a greater access to the slave market, and that's where more of their wealth came from. So you're seeing this dichotomy of the big lords siding with him and the minor ones siding with her. But it doesn't talk about it. But anyway, it fast forwards at this point to apparently the aftermath of something in which her sisters ended up getting captured, and she falls into this depression, but it skips all of the events of the previous months and year, which is really bad because this is the thing that I'm talking about, that Netflix deliberately skips that whole political crisis that was going on, which it shouldn't have, because if it didn't, then it would have actually shown her being a badass, because this is a thing that she did during this time, and I don't know why they didn't show this. because Hadi was so hated and was seen as weak and a puppet of the Portuguese, Njinga was able to constantly call him out and challenge him. She did things like sending him threats, essentially challenging him to battle, and when he panicked and refused and called upon the Portuguese for help, this just made a bunch of the nobles that were in the area see him as nothing more than the puppet that he was and side with Njinga. They were constantly competing over authority, and she was able to one-up him militarily, she was able to one-up him politically, she was able to do all of these things to turn people against him and show off her political prowess and skill, but it doesn't show it, and I don't know why Netflix wouldn't do this. It's a perfect opportunity. As again, I said, either way, I keep on having to go back and do these things because this is so frustrating. I swear, I'm getting so peeved with what this thing is doing because it's so irresponsible with how they're framing these things, and I don't understand why. But unlike what Netflix is showing, she doesn't just discover that her sisters were captured. No, what ended up happening is that over the course of a series of battles, she was defeated time and time again, and then in an ambush, she ended up losing over half of her forces and her sisters were captured. At least that's what the record tells us. Not, oh, she's off in the wilderness doing her own thing and then gets word of things having gone bad for her. Because again, it cannot show her in a weaker light, and it's so frustrating that it can't show events as they actually played out. So now that at this point she has pretty much lost everything, she is forced to go over to the Imangala in order to get some kind of help, which she does so after a whole bunch of strong speeches and cringy dialogue and everyone sticking up for her as the rightful queen, and more dialogue that is being put in by Netflix. It's just really bad at this point. So okay, she goes over to the Imangala, Kasenje, the great threat who had been her enemy for quite literally years. She ends up going to him with his force of 80,000 men, which mind you at this point, after all of her losses, she reportedly had only around 200 or so. And she ends up siding with him, negotiating with him, and although the dialogue in here is fake, it's real enough in the sense of what happens is that she negotiates with him to be his queen and help build him a kingdom in exchange for being given warriors and backing her militarily. It does then explain that after their marriage, in order for her to be able to lead the Imangala troops into battle, that she will need to participate in their ceremonies, and she does adopt to the Imangala culture rather quickly, one of which, as they were cannibals, included the consumption of blood, specifically human blood, to clarify. And over the course of this entire process, as it explains it with all of this weird supernatural videography, I don't even know how I'm phrasing it at this point, but the different cinematography that it shows here during this entire scene that is almost like a dream sequence, they're explaining over it that they don't know to the degree how much she was actually involved in any of these ceremonies, which is true, but they spend the entire time trying to obfuscate this in order to, I guess, shield her from as much of the horrible things that the Imangala did as possible. We do not know to the extent of how many things that she actually did for their culture, but the general consensus is that she did participate in the Blood Oath ceremony, which involved drinking human blood, and also apparently something that I was able to find called infanticidal, which I guess is the consumption of a type of oil that is made from a human infant, like a baby that was sacrificed. Something called the Magia Samba. And I'm not even going to begin to get in all of those details because obviously we're talking about something on YouTube and you can never know exactly what is going to happen on here. But yeah, they try to obfuscate this entire thing and not really go into detail about it because, well, again, that might frame her in a more negative light. So yes, she ends up marrying Kasenje, they move on, and she asks for warriors specifically to go out and take out the kingdom of Matamba, like to invade it, and she does. After a 4-year war, which they skip over all of it, she takes charge, ousts the current queen, and after the queen is captured, there's this whole scene where it shows an Imangala warrior who's about to finish her, and she goes, "No! We are not the Portuguese," as though once again framing the Portuguese as being the individuals who would just murder royalty. As, although her family had been murdering royalty, it seems like, especially in the case of her brother for a while, so it's a very weird thing to frame this in that set way in the first place. And also, it's not the way of the Portuguese to kill royalty. It's specifically a custom of the Imangala that when they take over a territory, that the rulers are executed, that they are killed. So that's what she's stopping here. This whole line that she's putting about in here, like, oh, we're not the Portuguese, we're better than that, is total bullshit. But it does show what she did, which is after taking over the kingdom of Matamba, she sent the queen into exile and she took the queen's daughter as hostage in order to make her one of her warriors. And there's this whole dramatic sequence during this entire thing, but there's nothing that is inherently wrong with it per se. But it's also weird again that they don't touch upon this, that Matamba had a queen. It was a queen that was in charge. And historically, the reason why she wanted to go after Matamba for her power base is because it already had a system, it already had a history of queens ruling the country, which means that her taking it over would serve as a much more stable power base versus her home country of Ndongo that was constantly fighting with her because she was a woman. That's why she chose it as a power base in the first place, but it completely skips this fact, and I do not know why it does not talk about it. Okay, I'm getting angry at this point. I know I was already getting angry. What am I even saying at this point? I'm fumbling because I'm so frustrated after going through this again. I was stopping my wife every like 5 to 10 seconds to tell her something while she was trying to edit one of my other videos, while I was preparing the notes for this, and she became incredibly frustrated with me because of this. And then that leads us to one of the final lines that it says in here for the episode, where it says, now that she has a queendom, or I guess a kingdom that she is the queen of, Njinga then has to make some very difficult choices, which is true, she does, including what she would use the kingdom of Matamba for in the first place, which was expanding the slave trade. And I don't know if in the final episode, which is the next episode after this, episode 4, if they're going to talk about it, but she specifically used the kingdom of Matamba after taking it over to invade the territories around her and sell their people into slavery so that she could fund her forces to be able to go after the Portuguese. She is responsible for hundreds of thousands, if not potentially millions of people being put into slavery, but it's probably not going to talk about it. At least that's the guess that I'm making right now, considering what has happened here at this point with how many other things that they omitted. She is a very complex character. She is a powerful character. She is one that has done so many varied things over history, good, bad, and everything in between. And Netflix leaves out so much of it just so that they can frame her as a hero. And it's so incredibly frustrating. I know this episode is a longer one. I apologize. I expected to make this one shorter because I thought, hey, after the previous 2 episodes, this was going to be a lot better. And I was wrong. I was so wrong. This was easily the worst episode yet of the series. And I hope that you all enjoyed me breaking it down. Thank you, everyone, for watching. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Make sure to check out my coffee, which I do have a coffee, by the way. You can get that over here in the description and also maybe in the comments if I remember to pin something. Check out the other things in my description because I am leading 2 trips over the course of the next year, one to Japan in November and one to Italy here this next spring. And also check me out on Patreon. And honestly, my brain is fried at this point after this episode. I have to end things here. Thank you everyone for watching. I wish you all the best of luck and goodbye. Thank you.